Hey, this is episode number 47 of Counterpoints. So this will obviously be a special tribute roast to the work of Paul Red Eye Challoner. No, obviously, just a little friendly joke across the bar there. One of the elder statesmen of esports, Red Eye, you'll appreciate that one, was then, Okay, so obviously this show, as usual, do have to mention at the top, it is sponsored by esportspools, and obviously, with Ave being here, actually his team, North, is actually a perfect team to make bets on, because here's the thing, they win just enough games, like a solid 60%, 65%, that you think to yourself, oh, fucking hell, they could do something now. So in the playoffs, you're going to get pretty good odds, right? But then what you do is go against them, because as me and Moses have learned at events, every time you think North has got that great playoff bracket and they could beat this team, it's pretty good. Yeah, they inevitably shit the bed, or they lose the really close game, and we all get depressed, except for people like Moses who have an irrational hatred of all things Danish for some reason, just because Anders has been beating him in all these bets. I don't know why. It's not his fault, is it?
Anders has soured me to the experience of Danish folk. Yeah, he's ruined everything. He's not the best ambassador you could have of Denmark.
Almost at that optic level for you, right? Anyway, so our guest for this episode is Ave. Now, I realize in Csgo, people still might not know who Ave is that much, because he was mainly coming on to work with North Academy initially, and then obviously the whole academy thing is sort of gone out the window because people have to get rid of their academies, and so then he was working also as an analyst with the main North team, the one with MSL and Config and all those guys. But for anyone who doesn't know, in CS 1.6, Ave basically was considered to be, if not the best, one of the best tactical in-game leaders. His team, funnily enough, had a very good even distribution of players. They didn't necessarily rely upon one star player. They just emphasized certain players at different points in time. They had a very tactical style of team. So the obvious counterpoint to give in terms of a reference in modern day is Astralis and it is Glaive, really, because these guys kind of play not the same exact style and role, but it's close enough for where they were competitively. MTW was always one of the best teams every single year, had a year where they were the best team, had a very tactical team, like I say. So I thought he would be a really good person to have a discussion, which is going to be the kind of theme of this episode, which is how do we actually contrast CSGO and CS 1.6 on a tactical level. Now, to start out with in this respect, okay, Ave, I thought the first thing I'd ask you was, since you weren't heavily into CSGO at the beginning, and in fact, maybe people don't know this, but you were one of the people who got out of 1.6 earlier than a lot of the others, actually. I remember your team ended it was 3/4 of the way through 2011 that the MTW squad disbanded, and then, whereas for example, Zonic stood in for Mouse Sports and Trace went off to SK and Fnatic, you were actually one of the ones who did just legit quit, pack it up. I think at the time, right, you just finished a degree or something similar, right? Or were you still doing it?
I was still doing it. I think I was nearing the end of my bachelor at that point, and the financial crisis kind of hit Counter-Strike really hard. So at that point, it just didn't make sense to play anymore, and was kind of frustrated with this whole situation with not a lot of tournaments and still a lot of teams competing really hard. So I got older and my priorities just changed. Yeah.
Yes, and I believe as well, a lot of people were not aware of this actually until somewhat recently, but your team was also one of the ones that really struggled in terms of the org not paying them sometime and then not getting some of the prize money. Like, for example, when you'd had good placings at Code 5, famously. I remember when I did my reflections with Wimp, he actually said this was one of the reasons why some of the MTW players had kind of lost motivation. So at the end, you kind of thought you were out of esports, right?
Yeah. I figured that was it, and Counter-Strike was kind of dead at that point, and Global Offensive looked really bad at that point. So just didn't make sense for me anymore.
Okay, so then when you I know, for example, that there was a story. I think it was I believe it was 2015, if my memory serves correctly, where the story was that MTW, the lineup that had been in 2010, I think it was going to come back. So you, Zonic, Trace, these guys were all going to come back. And then, actually, maybe it was 2016 then, because I believe one of the...
In December 15.
Right, okay, yes. But then because one of the key elements was obviously then Zonic went on to become the coach of Astralis, and then apparently the backup pulled out, and then also, this is a pretty good third reason. Apparently when you were playing all the games, people hadn't played in the team for a long time, so you weren't very good. So all these factors combined, pretty good reason not to go ahead with the comeback full on with 5 players who haven't played CSGO, except technically Trace had played it, but debatable whether he actually played it if you see how well he was doing in the game. So what I want to establish first before we jump in the conversation is just how much of CSGO were you watching before you started working with North? Like, did you still watch tournaments and watch the big matches? Were you in and out?
Yeah, I watch all the majors basically. Sometimes some of the minor tournaments if I had time for it, but I always watch the majors, really. Not so much in the beginning. I think it was only after, 2014 or something, I started being more involved and playing a little bit myself. But it was obvious that it was uphill in terms of my comeback. But yeah, I always watched the majors, at least.
Okay. So then let's just start here. I want to get your take first of all. So as someone coming from not just 1.6, but as I say, a heavy emphasis on tactics and anti-strats and coming up with like creative ways to change up your game. And famously, actually, another detail I'll throw in, MTW also was one of the teams that had a very deep map pool, which is another thing they share with Astralis and other such tactical teams today, right? How do you see CSGO? Because I remember when CSGO first came out, that's one thing that a lot of 1.6 players, and especially like tactical players, not just like very skilled players, complained about. They said that like there was a lot of problems with like positioning and peaker's advantage and all these terms that we've heard thrown around. So as someone now who's putting a lot of time with North Academy and North, how do you see CSGO tactically and how is it different?
I think like two of the biggest differences is obviously the Molotov and how that changes the gameplay. Also, the smokes are much different. You couldn't really rely upon smokes in 1.6. So that's a major deal. Then there's also like the Pegasus advantage, which kind of favors the terrorist side. But I think that's like evened out by the mollies you can throw as CT. So
yes.
Yeah, it's a very different game, and it's not the same as in 1.6 where you could basically just sit at an angle that's a good angle and just wait for your opponent. It's much different now. You don't have the advantage if you just sit there.
Yes. Okay, so let's start with the first thing you brought up then and make this a conversation then. So, Moses, give me your take on this, because obviously we didn't have a Molotov or anything comparable in 1.6, you know. There's just nothing that even vaguely filled that role. But when it came out in CSGO, for people who don't know, it actually was barely used early on. In fact, famously, this is one of the things in Cloud9 that they always said that actually, I think Sean Gers actually credited Semphis and said that he always had these ideas for it, but then everyone else was like, why are we going to waste money on that? It's too expensive, you know, let's just not bother. And so it was actually, off the top of my head, I don't think people really started using Molotovs until like late 2015 or something. I remember it was like most of those teams that you think of, like the LDLC teams that just ran in and shot everyone with an AK, no one was ever throwing a Molotov down when they went in at 25 seconds, you know? What do you think, Moses? What is the impact of the Molotov on CSGO?
Well, I think actually there was something in 1.6 that was like the Molotov, and it was the nades, because that's exactly how you use the HE grenades, right? To like force people out of positions and to clear out one spot. So, you know, nades stacking into a corner behind a box essentially is the same thing as throwing a Molotov behind that box and either killing the player or forcing him into the open so you can get an easier kill. But yeah, early on in CSGO, I remember how OP the Molotovs were when it first came out. Like you could throw them across the map and they would actually slow you down as you ran through them as well. I almost feel like at the beginning of CSGO, no one kind of understood the dynamic of it. And I think people were still kind of not necessarily looking at the game as ultra competitive in like that first year, at least in North America. It still very much felt like, you know, all of our early teams were essentially pug teams. Like they just came together because they were the best players from 1.6 at the end of it. And no one was kind of actually taking that tactical approach or anything like that or looking at the game in a competitive way. So Molotovs just kind of got shoved to the wayside. And then eventually, I think, I can't remember if like, I'm assuming North Americans started to learn from like the Europeans and Sean and Semphis started bringing those executes in. But I don't think people fully understood the best ways to use Molotovs early on. It took a lot of time to kind of get that understanding. Naturally, like Counter-Strike is a very slow changing meta where I think a lot of people were just so used to having HE grenades that no one ever valued the Molotov to any certain degree.
Okay, so what about that then, Ave? Because obviously that's actually, I mean, Moses is right. You have to kind of tie the two things together, because one thing that's very different from 1.6 is famously in CSGO, when you throw a nade, it's not really intuitive. Like you can't even really know what damage it did to the other guy, you know? Like you might land at his feet and it might do 2 or it might do 40, you know? So as a result, tactically, you can't really plan around grenades the same way you did in 1.6, right?
Yeah, but still I feel like in 1.6, a good example would be stairs on Dust 2. you would like stack 3 AG nades on stairs to make sure they're not standing there. But
on
still,
catwalk, right?
Yeah,
catwalk.
Yes, yeah. Still, the nades back then, they did more AoE, so they could land farther away from your enemy and still do like 20 damage. But still, you had to stack like 3 at least to make sure you could call it clear. So yeah,
and
I don't know.
Obviously, there was that weird aspect where they could sort of go round an object, like round the edge of a step or a wall or through a box or something, which obviously can't exist in CSGO.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so what about Molotovs then? What changed up with Molotovs? Like, if you're working with a team and analyzing and helping with tactics, what's the function of a Molotov in CSGO? Do you think?
I feel like they are really powerful in certain situations. So, for example, as CT, if you feel like the execute is coming, you can throw your molly real quick, and then you can really deny their timing. So, let's say they smoke up on cobblestone, make a B execute. You can just throw that molly up on the plateau, and then they're kind of forced to wait like 10 seconds or take a lot of damage. So that's really like the perfect way to use molos as CT. Then as terrorist, you could use them to clear out those angles you kind of feel like that your opponent likes the most. So let's say a certain player likes to stand somewhere on the map, you can just molly that place and wait for him to peek out. Yeah, like chicken coop, for example, on cobblestone.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually one of the areas where, funnily enough, it's funny, this is actually one of the interesting things I think about Counter-Strike, is that even if people do figure out what, like, in theory, in like a computer sense would be the ideal way to play, people are just human, and let's face it, a lot of the players are like 19 years old, so it doesn't mean they're going to do it in the game. So, for example, that example you gave there, I'm still to this day amazed that so many more players and teams don't do that. They don't make it so that, like, right, well, if we've both got a Molotov, right, you agree that you're going to save yours till the end in case they come in, I'll use mine now early. The amount of players that still throw it super early and then maybe they delay something else by 5 seconds, like someone peeking a corner, but then they don't have it for the late execute. It's actually amazing how many players never really think that through,
Misuse utility is like the great crime in professional Counter-Strike. The fact that we don't have, like, if you watch, for instance, if you watch a pro team, not just that example, but if you ever watch flashbangs and how flashbangs are used, sometimes you'll just see some motherfucker just throw a random flashbang like up middle on a map, and it's not actually for anything. It's not for a peek. It's just like, oh, I'm not doing anything at this point in time, so maybe I just throw a flashbang and look like I'm being useful for a couple seconds.
Well, it's for example, okay, like Lurpus always made this point about force spying, like just only pistols and armor, and he's totally right on it, I think, which is like, yes, okay, it can be good at certain times, yes, there's a logic to it, yes, CSGO is different and the guns are more powerful, but let's be real, sometimes people do it just because it's fun. It's not fun to just have Glocks for a round and then try and do something where you're probably going to die. So a lot of really good players are like, no, it's going to be more fun, let's force spy it now, they almost don't say no to it. So in the same sense, I actually get the feeling this is one of the reasons why in this case, for utility, people waste it, is because just like noobs, we all still have that same feeling where the worst feeling in the world is when you die and then you're like, shit, I had a nade and a flash and a Molotov. Like somehow people feel like using it early. It's like, oh, at least I got to use it somehow. That has to play a factor. Even though these are pro players, they're still just human after all.
Yeah, I actually think that's really true. I remember it when I played myself that sometimes you would just like, okay, they're probably going to come really soon. So now I'll just throw my nade, hope it hits someone, stuff like that. Even though it might have looked stupid as for the spectators, but yeah, it's annoying to die with you.
Yeah, you die like pulling out a flashbang in the round before, so you're just like, fuck it, I'm getting rid of these things. I don't really want to do it.
Yeah, exactly. That's also a good point. Yeah.
Okay.
It happens.
So another thing you brought up, okay, which is interesting, is the whole peeker's advantage thing. Because funnily enough, I can actually remember the early days of CSGO, where we were people from 1.6 were trying to explain this concept to people who only had played CSGO. And the reason why I remember it was always so confusing to them is because actually when the game first started, like terrorist sides on most of the maps weren't actually very good. People hadn't figured out how to use them effectively, basically. And so the game seemed pretty CT-sided, actually. So people kept saying like, but how can there be a peeker's advantage if the CTs are winning all the time, which is like, that's not really actually relevant, that's like other factors are involved with that, like people couldn't spray very well, for example, when they ran in, obviously, again, as we're saying, nades weren't that good. There was all other factors, right? But one of the factors, and you kind of touched on this at the end there, that really does affect things with peeker's advantages. I always say this to people, if you look at a lot of the people who had to retire very early in CSGO, they were the players like Cuban and Lord or Senya from Na'Vi, who, let's face it, as players, they weren't that skilled. They were just okay skill level. But their whole game was based around the idea of like holding an angle or being able to just spray someone when they came around the corner, not having to hit a headshot instantly, you know. So when you add in the Pika's advantage and make some super aggressive, skilled player come around the corner, first of all, he's just going to instantly two-bang the guy in the head before he can shoot him and spray him. And then secondly, again, there is this weird thing where he'll sort of appear half a second earlier for himself than he will for them in that, well, it's not half a second, obviously I've exaggerated there, but you know what I mean? Like it adds a different dynamic because in a way, you could sort of play a bit more by the numbers in Csgo 1.6 in that sense, that you could kind of know if I'm holding this angle here, I could probably at least get some bullets in the first guy and then maybe kill him and fall, but you know, you could sort of use that logic, right?
Yeah.
I think when I first started to experience Pika's advantage when I started playing CSGO, it made me feel so fucking old because it felt like
your reactions were shit.
Yeah, it felt like your reactions were like 2 seconds slower than they used to be. And I was just, oh, you die so quick. I think the main thing that Pika's advantage seems to have done from my perspective is because in 1.6, I was the kind of player who like just always made like the right decisions on like a fundamental tactical basis. You know, I wasn't like too insanely skilled, but I was just very good at positioning and decision making. So that was good enough to compete at a professional level. I think it took a lot of that black and white out because in 1.6 in different situations, you had like, this is the correct move to make over here and this is the wrong move. And they were very clearly defined right and wrong depending on the situation you were in. And CSGO with Pika's advantage, there's far less. It's far more muddled. It's like in the middle where yes, it could be a wrong decision, but you have this advantage of like, you know, the 1 second when you actually peek, you have an advantage over the defender holding the angle. So while it seems wrong in like your brain and Counter-Strike terms, it can actually work out. So it's kind of taken away some of that right or wrong and given the individual a lot more freedom to kind of determine his fate within that round or within that situation.
Yeah, okay. I agree very much with that. Also, like the thing you said with you feeling old in the certain situations, I had the same experience. I mean, like when the first time you get crouch peeked by an AWP, and you that's like, wow, how the fuck can you be so fast? It makes no sense.
Yes.
Yep. But it's really it made the game very much different, that the Pika's advantage, because also you saw that in 2015, I feel like Fnatic was one of the teams that it just looked like 5 individuals who were really good and they played their own game and they were really good at it and they just won because they only had to focus on themselves and they just hit their shots every time it seemed like.
Okay, so how does it affect the tactical side, do you think, the Pika's advantage element, or the fact that you can't just kind of play positionally? What do you think it changes up how you have to approach the game? Because clearly some teams still can be very tactical, like Astralis, etc., but it's something different about the approach, right? Yeah,
it's different because I feel like there are more playing styles right now in the Global Offensive that there were in 1.6. In 1.6, every team played kind of the same style, I feel. Most of the teams had executes they relied upon. Now you see more and more teams who just play map control all the time, play their default strats and just take the map step by step, and then just strafe at the right time when they want to attack. Yeah.
Well, if you put it this way, oh, sorry, do you have something, Moses?
Oh, you can go on. I don't know.
Basically, like my thought when you were saying that's one of the ways I often describe. Like, here's the thing: it's not that it's bad or good, because obviously every style and every component can be exciting or interesting, you know. But I do notice that there are so many top teams in CS:GO, where, as you say, what they do is they have like an initial base tactic. Okay, like let's take map control here. Let's use a little bit of utility to ensure we've got that area, but then they make individual plays. Like, right, let's let the guy who's our playmaker or entry, he's going to do a move here where he's essentially just going to pick a duel and the time when he wants to go and take the 1v1. And then, yes, maybe we decide who to follow up on after that. But largely, that is kind of like a little bit gimmicky, you know, because it's more individual than a real tactic, you know. You're not really having like a whole set tactic coming out of the spawn that you're definitely going to run, because you're not really going to know what's going to happen once you get to that middle point.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think it has opened up on your T sides. Definitely, it almost feels like each team that wants to be like at the top tier has to have like one of those insane like individual playmakers. Like you need like a Fur, a Stewie, a Config, like guys who are just willing to like, you know, bull rush their way through a smoke or just make some kind of an insane play. Just because, not because it's always going to work, but just because when it does work, it's like an automatic ground win if it's like successful. You know, those kinds of plays, you need a guy like that. But I think the biggest impact it's had, like Peaker's Advantage has had on tactics, is actually on the CT side, because it actually promotes aggression on the defense. Like, you know, you can't just sit there and hold an angle. So you're seeing CT teams who are willing to do more, you know, flash timing peaks, you know, to control Banana on Inferno. You're seeing teams and players more willing to push up as CT and be aggressive and take a fight. I remember in like 1.6, especially if you go way back, I mean, there's been a bunch of things that have changed. I remember in like 2003, there was never aggression from the CT sides because the round timers were 3 minutes long, so a terrorist team could just sit and wait. And then that eventually changed and got brought down. But this progression where now this Peaker's Advantage has completed the fact that you can have highly aggressive CT sides. That's why we see individuals peeking down A ramp on Mirage or into Palace. It's given a lot more freedom to both sides of the map in that sense, even if I still disagree with it.
Okay. Yeah. Because I mean, the positive to me is like, okay, if I'm trying to look at it like being objective, sure, that's good for fans in a way because they get to see like their star players making all these crazy plays and it's exciting. You never know what's going to happen because the player himself doesn't necessarily know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But it has made it harder to have like the full execute style team. Like the point I'm making here is in 1.6, I can almost think of no teams that played that way, where they just took map control and then let like the star player, the entry play, like maybe really extreme ones, like maybe if you were on like a low econ buy and you know the only one who has a gun is Neo or something, maybe you sit and let him work for something, but that's not a full gun round tactic, you know. On the full gun round tactic, as you're saying here, you know, we're gonna nade the catwalk and then someone's gonna peek mid and then maybe we're gonna split mid because we know they can't do a fast rotation from you know, you kind of have a logic, and you're gonna read the game, but you also have a lot prepared in advance, right, that you're gonna playbook from. Like when you're working with North in this sense, is it tougher then to game plan for teams or to have like a set built up amount of tactics that you're gonna use?
Yeah, it is tougher, definitely. Also the point Moses touched upon, that CT sides are played so aggressively now. So oftentimes you end up having a plan and then you see that plan shattered within, I don't know, 30 seconds of the round or something like that. So it's tougher to, I really feel like I also did a lot of the analyst work when I was in game leader back in 1.6. So I analyzed the opponents, how their tendencies and stuff like that. And I felt like it was easier back then to say, okay, they run this kind of execute where they throw these nades, and we just have to make sure we counter flash them at the right time, or stuff like that. Now it's when you, for example, SK, when you try to anti-strat SK, it's like, for example, Mirage, I can tell the team, okay, you're gonna see Fur come link at the connector at some point, and you're gonna see Colzero peak over catwalk and stuff like that. But it's like you don't know when it's gonna happen, so it's really hard to play against. Really, even though you know it's probably gonna happen, you don't know when, so you have to guess. And when you start guessing as CT, then it's oftentimes bad stuff happens. Yeah.
Sure.
It's much easier to play CT when you can just call out, okay, they're executing. They run the execute we prepared for, and everybody on the team knows what's happening.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. And also, I mean, I think it's harder now because you never know. Remember at the beginning of CSGO, we still had that universe where, at least I don't know if it was existed in Europe, but I know in North America, you know, the famous thing was Semphis always calling them the scrimmy plays. Like when it wasn't just Semphis, it was essentially everyone, but just like scrimming would be like pushing through the smoke or being the sole aggressor to push down, you know, push some part of the map on your own. And all of a sudden you're a terrorist team and you're lining up for an execute and there's some motherfucker who within 20 seconds is already halfway across the map, like shooting you in the back. Those are plays that we see all the time now in professional Counter-Strike. But again, it's that slow changing meta of Counter-Strike where we're very like, you know, there was still at that point that thought process of thinking of the game as we thought about it in like 1.6, like before like the real pure CSGO players actually started coming up through the scene. You had all the old guard of 1.6 being like, oh, that's stupid. You'd never do that. Yeah. But it works in this game. So it just took a while to kind of adapt to that, I think, and for people to start thinking in terms of not just like the theory that they learned from 1.6 or Source, but also developing a theory for CSGO and how that can be played as well.
Yes. And another thing as well that I think definitely carried over is, like, okay, yes, in 1.6, a fundamental concept was, like, to trade off the enemy. So if our entry guy dies here, then we re-peek and we kill the guy who just killed him, okay? But I feel like in CSGO, I mean, feel free to disagree if you don't agree, but I actually think, like, the trade killing thing just almost became, like, the fundamental principle of the game. Like, because when you peek a corner, first of all, they aren't as effective spray downs for CTs. You don't see the guy like they used to on Inferno on 1.6 on the B site who just holds that angle and sprays this whole clip and kills the 4 guys. That almost never happens now. So what happens instead is when you have these people who can do these aggro peaks, you almost do it like, okay, right, our guy died, we re-peek and kill him, and then if there's another CT there, maybe he peeks out and tries to kill, and it just goes down by the numbers till we've got like a 2-on-3 or something, you know. Whereas like there was a component of that in 1.6, but I don't feel like it was as pronounced. Like teams didn't literally think in their brain, this is what we're going to do and how we're going to trade onto this guy here to get onto the site eventually by some means, you know. What are your thoughts on that, Ave?
Yeah, I get your point, and I feel like you're right that it was not as common back then to see people who played, we call it contact. So if somebody shoots, then you're gonna strafe and help him shoot. It wasn't as common back then. Back in 1.6, flashes were really effective. So much of the time you would have a guy, for example, at B Inferno, a guy who was up on the B side, and you would have a guy in CT spawn or something with his flashbang ready to throw his flashbang. So when the terrorist would step in B, the guy in CT spawn would just throw his flashbang immediately, and that was kind of how you played together back then. But today you don't see you more see people who play contact or who uses their mollies really quickly and stuff like that. So it evolved a little bit, but I feel like the contact approach could have been used more in 1.6 and probably should have been used more in 1.6 because it's really an effective way to play, in my opinion. Okay.
What would it have brought to 1.6 then, do you think? Like what scenarios should people have tried it out in?
Yeah, for example, with B Inferno, it could have been used more, at least on my teams, I feel like. Also, other maps, I feel like it could have been effective. But still, like, the thing it's more common now is because of the peak advantage, again, you have advantage when you are the guy who is ready to strafe on contact. So you didn't have that back in 1.6, so that's maybe why it wasn't used more. I don't know.
Which actually makes me think of another factor that has to play into tactics. But I mean, I hope you're going to tell me how, because I don't claim to have all the answers, right? Which is added into the peeker's advantage element is the lack of wall bangs on a lot of spots on the map changes how you peek. So for example, if I let's just think of like a classic map, DOS 2. If I'm going to try and peek long A, and the guy, the AWP's at the corner like usual, or there's a guy with a rifle at the same corner in the pit, you know, right? When I peek out, I can't just peek all day on that corner, like what Americans call a jiggle peek. Like, just keep pushing my elbow out, going back in and out. Because if I do that, you can just shoot me through the wall as I'm going back through, and I still die anyway, you know. So logically, I have to either commit to it, or, in fact, usually people only jiggle to take the aim drill. Like, they want you to miss, and then they come out, you know. In CSGO, you can also do these aspects in the first part of the play where you're all setting up on all the spots, and it's a bit trickier, like, especially if you're an AWP, because obviously you can't afford to just miss and then the guys come out. So I'm not sure how, but how do you think that's impacted CSGO, that component? Because obviously there are a lot less wall bangs in that sense.
Specifically the A-long. I know where you meant on A-long. I remember when you saw a AVP standing there, and he shoots the first terrorist who comes out, then every other terrorist would just strafe out and spray the wall, because most of the time you would just instantly refrag him. So yeah, and you can see that in the global offensive, that's not an option anymore. So you can just keep re-peeking with the AVP, and it really makes life easier in certain situations. But it also helps the terrorist side. For example, a map like Nuke was a total mess in 1.6.
Yes, that's a piece of shit.
Yeah, was such a stupid map. So you would just have 3 CTs standing outside the bomb spot A in the yard area and just wallbang when you hear terrorists were flashing or something like that. It was just stupid to
that
watch.
was a map where like you would watch like the first minute of a round or like 45 seconds of a round, and every single person on the map would be spamming down to like 20 bullets left in their clip. Like they wouldn't even have any ammo to reload with.
Well, that's also, by the way, the reason why I always thought that map was super CT sided. Like, yes, the architecture and the few chokes you've got to get through and the height advantage for CTs, but a big factor as well is for the first 35 seconds of the round, if you're terrorist, your main job is just hope I'm not stud where he accidentally headshots me from the lobby, you know. If he shoots me for no reason in the wall, we've got a way better chance of this tactic working out because I have 5 health, you know. So I mean, that's not really a tactic, you know.
It is also fundamentally flawed with the fact that your defense doesn't even have to defend the bomb site. As soon as they take upper, you just, you know, you have 3 people in position that you just spam the coordinated spots and you're going to get 1 kill out of it. I think like I don't mind the no wall bangs in CS:GO. I would like to have like more of them. Like for like certain situations, for instance, you know, that middle box on Inferno in the A bomb site, like an old missile box. I think it's really, really stupid that someone can stand behind that box and just like pop their head up once in a while whenever they choose to.
And it's only a headshot angle. Yes.
Yeah. That's so that should be spammable. I almost feel like, you know, the box at the back of B bomb site at A. Actually, I don't even know if it's there in the new Dust 2. I haven't even played it yet, but that should be like those spots where you could just pop up and down and it's just a headshot.
Yes, you're right. He's talking about the AWP spot on the platform at the back of B, which obviously, yes, in CS:GO that's ridiculous that you can just keep ducking down there. And it's like, well, he's invincible. Like, what? Just shoot him. Oh, I can't. That's right. He's behind a box. There are too many headshot angles like that in CS:GO because the problem with it is, right, this might sound weird because fans are going to think, well, this sounds like you're describing a good thing. But when you have headshot only angles, you now skew the game so heavily to people who have ridiculous single bullet headshot aim. Like people who are normal humans who might otherwise be very smart players and great team players, they can't just spray and then get the kind of guaranteed kill if the other guy misses. So it's not that it's good or bad necessarily. It just, to me, it overemphasizes one part of the game, whereas I would hope all elements of the game exist, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind the headshot angle so much. It's just like the locations of certain ones are just so overpowered. Like those two.
Well, I mean, the one that you gave the example of, the Inferno one, the big problem with that is it ends up affecting 1vx too often. So, for example, you get these amazing players who win like a 1v3 where literally people are coming from all sides on the A site. That shouldn't be winnable, but they just hide behind that box and just peek out non-stop, and you can just sometimes get lucky. Whereas, you know, in that scenario, like, you have to say fair play to the other team. They did surround you. They're probably supposed to kill you at that point.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Ave?
Yeah. I forgot. Yeah, but I feel like I've always been I like the no wall bangs a lot because I felt like in 1.6, one of the most annoying ways to die was just to step out somewhere and the guy randomly just wants to wall bang that place and you're just dead within 2 seconds or something. Yes. It's so nice to not see that happen all the time.
There were just too many in 1.6, weren't there? Like even at the B bomb site on Dust 2, like there were like 3 spam spots from those double doors as a CT. Moses, that was just outrageous.
Like that's actually the good way I think you could describe it if someone was thinking from Valve or a map of like, what should I introduce wall bangs? The key point is there weren't actually any created wall bangs in 1.6. What happened is every single wall could be wall banged, and it famously, it was depending on how many textures it had. If it was just one texture, it worked like just a thin wall. And famously, if it was 2, like, you know, only an AWP or a Deagle or something could go through it, I think. And so there was just a logic to it. So every wall that you saw, you knew if someone could be behind it, you could wall bang it. The problem is, in CSGO, obviously very few things can be wall banged. I just would prefer either A, there was a logic to it, like, you know, every color, every texture, this color can be wall banged, so, you know, everyone knows that this can happen. Or B, that you do actually, as a map designer, think to yourself, right, I would like it if there was a wall bang here, so let me make something that can be wall banged here. I think that would be a cool way to do it, because it kind of gets around the problem that Abe's describing, which is when just anything can be wall banged, first of all, you're going to end up with stuff that the map designer obviously never had any clue would be wall banged, such as all the nuke examples, which, you know, if I wanted to design a good map, I would definitely not let you just spam all the areas that the terrorist has to set up to come out of, because I always said it like this: there's no actual cost, like effectiveness there. If the guy isn't behind the wall when I spam my 1 bullet from ramp room, I just lose a bullet. I don't get punished for it. But if he's there, I just headshot him and he loses loads of health. You know, there's no counterplay, and also there's no cost to it, you know. Whereas instead, if it was like only certain spots, and then maybe, for example, you know, it's a spot where you might have to take an advanced position or something to wall bang it, at least there'd be like a logic and kind of like a meta game around it, you know, as opposed to just either no wall bangs or infinite wall bangs. You know? And neither of those seem reasonable to me.
Yeah, there's got to be a comfortable middle ground somewhere. So you'd like to say. I think the one thing I will say about wallbangs is not even like in terms of gameplay, but from a spectator point of view, wallbangs have got to be so confusing for like a new viewer and for like a viewer just getting into Counter-Strike to watch. Like if I was a spectator. If I'd never seen Counter-Strike and I was watching like a 1.6 nuke match, I'd be like, this is fucking ridiculous. Like, why do people play this fucking game? You know, like, why would you want to watch that?
Yeah, if anybody wants to like look up what we're talking about, specifically on nuke, they can just YouTube nothing highlight.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like it must have been one of the most watched highlight for some reason. I'm not sure, but it has a lot of views. But it's
you mean the one against? Highlight. It was the one that was against the Koreans. I think they were called like Red Code or something at that point. It was the We Made Fox team, but I think they were called that. It was at the last 1.6 World Championship, I think. It was either the 2011 one or 2012. I think it was
Red Code.
Yes, and it was the one where on Nuke he literally just kills all them by sound cues when they're near like the furthermost vent, you know, the one that you can hide behind when you plant the bomb or whatever. Like he just spams them all and kills them all without ever seeing anyone.
It's a 1 versus 5 as well, by the way.
Holy shit! Okay, that's why they.
It was out of
so
control.
Many times.
Yeah. I'm watching it right now. He kills 3 before it wasn't a 1 versus 5. This someone lied on YouTube. He kills the first 3 without them even like seeing him. It's actually he kills 4 people without them ever seeing him. They don't even show up on a screen. Just the kills right down.
That was stupid.
Duncan will put it in the info. He'll put a little arrow down there.
I'll put a little link. Okay, so I've got a question then. So since, as I said in the intro, famously, you were the guy who was known for having, like, this is mainly before other people did this generally. Like, you know, there was the odd person who did it, like Veslin or something like that, or Vilden or something. You know, a few of these guys were very tactical, but you took not only doing the tactics and having the playbook, but scouting the opponent very, very seriously, like writing down all of his tendencies and having all the notes. And then the idea is you can show some of these to your team just before you play them on a laptop, you know, this was actually an innovation at the time. Right, as someone who's taken that approach, and then, as you're saying, now you've been working in analysis, so this is basically the job that you're doing for North and for North Academy. What's tough about trying to do that in CSGO? Because obviously some teams still try it, but is it as effective? Is it tough? Were there different challenges? Does some of it apply the same? What's your take?
My take is really it works on some opponents. Some opponents that mostly use executes, then it's easier to gain advantages, but when you watch, for example, a team like SK, as I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to figure out what they're doing because it kind of seems the same a lot of the time, but when you play them, it feels very different, the timings and stuff like that. So it really depends on the opponent if you can gain any advantages, because you can also, if you think too much about it, then you can kind of mindfuck yourself. And then you're so confused what's happening because, I thought they were doing it like this, and then stuff happens 30 seconds later or sooner and stuff like that.
Is there anything like, because, I mean, we've talked a little bit about like the peaker's advantage and how much more power it's given to like individuals. Have you noticed any like tendencies of like specific individuals of like when they like make their kind of plays? Is there anything that you can kind of research into that, or is it just one of those, you know, like the old Fnatic lineup, because of the way they played, everyone just said it's impossible to scout because you never know. Yeah. They never know what they're going to do until they're in the situation playing by instinct. Do you kind of see that across most teams with some of the plays they make?
Yeah, it feels like a lot of teams play like that. So it's getting harder to anti-strat, but I also feel like it's because people know that people are trying to do this because the game has gotten so big, so everybody has an analyst that works for them and scouts the opponent. So every team, they emphasize a lot of the time that we have to play a style that the opponent can't figure out. So I think a lot of the teams right now, because SK has so much success, they look to their style of play, and then a lot of teams are playing in a similar style. Not exactly the same, because it's really hard to mimic how SK plays, but yeah. I still feel like certain elements, like you can tell that SK is a team that takes map control slowly, and then somebody takes initiative. I don't know if I feel like they have maybe 4 players who can take initiative in certain situations, and then just make simple plays like strafe on a bomb site with 1 flash or something really simple. That's like what you see more often in this day and age.
Okay. Is it harder when you're working with teams? And obviously, if you're not the in-game leader, you don't have the direct power to tell them to do this. Is it harder to get CSGO players on board to do certain tactical things, or to study the opponent, or to read up on the notes that you make for them?
Most of the time I've worked with the academy team, and I feel like they are really open for what I come with. But still, it's also like that trade-off with not being over-prepared, I sometimes call it, because it can hurt you in some situations if you just... If the opponent knows that you study them and they are trying to make it look like an execute, and then they do maybe make a fake out of it, then it's starting to hurt the team that you are trying to play this anti-strat kind of style. So it's a trade-off. It's nice to know certain certain things about their play, but like, for example, a good example of what I look for often is which players go where on the terrorist default. So, for example, on cache, who plays the doors, on who goes towards the doors on cache, and who goes towards B sunroom and stuff like that. So, simple stuff like that can help, because then when you kill an opponent in sunroom, you can just, it's probably just they're playing their default because I killed the Cold Zera in sunroom.
Okay.
That's the simple way to analyze the opponents right now. You can also dig deeper, but I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out how to make it more consistent, because I have had varying experiences with preparing for opponents.
Okay. So Moses, I feel like you can definitely talk to this, but as a general broad stroke kind of guideline, I do feel like generally CSGO players put less kind of stock in tactics themselves anyway, because first of all, not as many teams seem as heavy on the executes as it is. Like, a lot of them are just having very good players, taking basic control, then making plays out of that. And so to them, it's more like just knowing what the correct follow-up move is when they see a move happen, or something happen. It's more like, what do I do next? Whereas actually, I do feel like in past games, because aspects like being able to just hold an angle and then not having a Molotov, etc., certain aspects meant that actually, because you would kind of get wrecked by extremely good tactical teams, people to some degree had to learn it more, or embrace that it had some kind of importance to it. Because the reason I say, Moses, you surely can speak to this, is because I look at a lot of the sort of modern generation of NA players, and they all seem like they think pro players like a more advanced version of rank S, like they don't really think heavy tactics and real like reads are that important, seemingly,
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's not nearly as much of an emphasis on like watching demos and studying like how to play the game and like how to play at an individual level in certain situations than we had in 1.6. That was a huge part of 1.6 teams was watching demos and everything, and POVs. I think the tough part, once again, it comes back to that, like there's two things I think that affect that. One is it goes back to, in 1.6 you had the right versus the wrong answer. You have a lot less of that in CSGO, so there's a lot less reliance on kind of knowing the right answer, since there's 100 different options you can do at any one moment in CSGO. And then just the individualistic nature of the play, like you can have success being individual, but well, with the fact that NA leans towards that, this is also the reason why we have never had a team that's able to consistently compete, because those individual play styles and if you're going to rely on an individual play to bail you out or give you progress in a situation, it is the least reliable option. You want to have the team coordinated flashbangs, you want to have the team coordinated trading, you want to have the team coordinated pinch onto a bomb site, and that's what we see like Europeans do it. That's why people have been hyped up about Team Liquid, because we see Team Liquid starting to do it, and those are what's going to get you consistency to be able to stay in top fours in multiple tournaments back to back to back, or lift trophies, or stay in the top 5 world rankings throughout the entirety of the year. It's not going to be how good your individual player is and the plays he makes. It's those small fundamental teamwork portions. So it's funny, because I think I always termed it like strategy versus tactic, where strategy was like the overall goal of the round and the tactics were the small things that you did to get there. I don't think it necessarily matters. You can call it like micro versus macro. But I think CSGO has a lot less of like the broad picture of the strategy and a lot more of the tactics, because you have to make those decisions very, very quick. And I think, you know, in split seconds, you have a player who might not want to do this in this situation, but because his teammate's already making an individual play, he's now kind of sucked into having to just go along with it because that's the best option available.
Okay. What do you think of that, Ave?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of Moses says, but and if you put that in contrast to 1.6, I feel like I kind of controlled how we played so much more than I feel like other teams are playing, because yeah, like Moses said, people are playing on initiative now. So in 1.6, the way you would play often, it was like, okay, we're gonna, for example, nuke, we're gonna wallbang for 1 minute, and then we're gonna do our A execute on when there's 35 seconds left or something like that. That was kind of, you could call that in freeze time, and everybody would just do that, and that was that. And then in global offensive, you see, all these initiative plays that, like Moses talked about.
Sure.
It was a lot slower in 1.6.
Yeah,
so you had the time to like get the information and kind of process it and make a better decision for the most part. The trouble in CS:GO now is you have to take people off the leash, and you have to allow them to do that initiative, because not only are you dealing with, you know, the insanity of the nades and the smokes and everything like that, but CT players or T players, whoever it's going to be, they're going to come through that smoke. Like some motherfucker is going to be a psychopath rushing at you. In 1.6, that just never happened. In CS:GO, you have to be on your toes at every single moment. So if you're a player, you can't, you know, just be sat there staring at the clock with a nade out for 10 seconds. You know, you can't just be mindlessly waiting for the execute to come. There's always going to be something coming at you, which is, it's kind of a cool aspect, but it does get frustrating, I think, or it certainly was frustrating when I started getting into CS:GO and having that experience.
So it feels unfair. It feels unfair when you start playing global offensive, because like, wait, why am I losing to this guy? It makes no sense. It's so wrong. So, but yeah, right or wrong is not the same anymore.
Did you ever, I know, because I did this, and I know most pro players from 1.6 did this, is like when they stopped competing at like the high level, right? Like they all spent like a season or like, you know, a year winding down and just playing with their friends in like the lower divisions. And I always found playing in the lower divisions after being a pro for 2 years was the hardest Counter-Strike I've ever fucking played, because you can't ever read the game. Like when you go from pro level and you know exactly what the correct rotation is, exactly where the next person's going to be, and then you drop down to like open, the players are less skilled, but some motherfucker is just going to be randomly in an area which doesn't make any sense. So that was like what I felt like playing CS:GO for the first time, is like, why is this happening? Like, why is this guy making this kind of a play?
Yeah, that's exactly the same experience I had when I started playing global offensive. It was so obvious that my game sense was totally off, and I mean, I was never a player who won because I was very talented or anything like that. I mean, I just studied more and thought more in the game than most people, I think. So that's where I had my advantage, and it became really clear when I started playing global offensive that those skills aren't valued as much in the. So I think I played like a decent amount for 1 month, and then I realized, okay, I'm never going to be good at this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is, when you were saying that scenario there, Moses, about like the way a lot of the NA players do like go to the scrimmy style, and partly, I don't blame them, partly it's because to some degree it works, that you can be very individualistic in 1.6. And I actually also do think that there's a component where they've looked at some of the teams we're talking about, like Olaf Meister and Fnatic, or even worse, the Fnatic, where they had like Dennis and Flusher, and they were just doing ridiculous, like, you know, famously, they would make like 2 plays on the map at the same time. Like someone would push out here, and then someone else would push out. So it's like you didn't even know what was coming at you, right? If you watch that and you're an up-and-coming NA player, you might think to yourself, oh, that's even how the best players play. I'm supposed to play individualistically. And if you look in history, unfortunately, I feel like it got skewed a little bit, because, like, for example, think of the really tactical teams. Well, first of all, a lot of the existence teams made up the very tactical teams. Well, the fact that they kept bombing all the majors doesn't help, because then people are going to think, oh, that doesn't work. And so for me, that's why I was actually so glad when we had the fucking Na'Vi team get good enough players, so they were really consistent. Obviously, the Astralis team in the last sort of year and 2 months or something, they were able to show that real tactics can work, and you can have these roles, and you don't have to just make kind of crazy plays all over the map. Because, certainly CSGO seems to reward it more, but it's clearly not the best style alone, because as you were mentioning now, I was thinking this when you were saying it. When you were saying that the problem with that style is like, okay, the obvious example here is Cloud9 in the Stewie 2K era, right? Whenever they've had Stewie 2K, because that's his style of play, they can only go as far as their shots getting hit made them go. So if they have a great tournament and Automatic's on fire, Stewie 2K is on fire, or Tarek and then they can win some matches. Their problem is, as soon as they have that game where people aren't hitting their shots, or even worse, the other team is like FaZe and they're hitting all their shots, it's game over. And whereas, here's the great example if you're one of those teams as to why you don't want to only have that style alone, is because FaZe right now is showing that can't be your only style, because they've done the most OP version of that ever, where you just get all the superstar players, and surely this game someone's going to go off, and then at least if he doesn't go off, Rain will go off, and if he doesn't go off, maybe Olofmeister. Well, even they can't win every tournament, because even they have a game where that doesn't work. It's too extreme.
Yeah, it's it's probably the playstyle that has the highest peak, but like the consistency is so, like, to get it down is just so difficult. Like, I don't know if we'll ever see a team really master it the way that Fnatic did, towards the end of 2015, early 2016, when they won those like 7 or 8 straight. I don't think that'll ever be repeated these days. But I think also it's kind of cool. Like, in that sense, I really, really like what CSGO has provided, because like Abe said at the beginning of the show, was we have different playstyles in CSGO that works, and like 1.6, you had like basically like the execute playstyle, and you kind of had to play that to varying degrees, but you had to play it. And this, you can have, the teams that want to be individual. Yeah, they're not going to have like the era, they're not going to create a dynasty, but they can have that insane run in a tournament. You can have the map control teams like Astralis. You can have a team like SK that blends both. So you have all these different playstyles, and you just have to adjust it based off your personnel. And I think that's where CSGO is kind of stagnant. We have all these playstyles, but I don't think we have a great system, or like we haven't quite figured out how in-game leaders and coaches aren't experienced enough, or don't know how to change their playstyle based off the personnel they have. It seems like you get players and you have this in-game leader, and he's like, this is the style I want to play. We're going to play this style. And you just try and fit the players to the system, where in reality, it should be the other way. You should be fitting your system around the players that you have. And I think that's kind of an area where I think it comes down to not having enough tools to properly judge the strength of players and how good they are in certain scenarios and situations. But I think we have too many things where you're trying to fit, like the old adage that's like, trying to fit the round peg into the square, into the square hole or whatever it might be.
I believe it's the other way around.
Yeah, whatever. Square peg,
would fit into a...
Yeah, fuck off. I realized it as I was going. Okay. I'd gone too far.
Okay, point taken anyway.
Yeah, I think you're right about that oftentimes you see in-game leaders who force their style upon the team, and I think it's a good point. And you actually see it in other sports. For example, NFL. I watch NFL quite a deal, and the good coaches in NFL often they come in and they fit their system to the players, and that's what, for example, what Belichick did in the beginning.
We just call him God here in America.
Yeah. And,
I just call him a cheating little bastard. But we all have different perspectives, Yeah,
but I feel like I think Moses is right about that. But it's tough to evaluate the team, what their strength is, and what kind of style would work for the. It's really rare that you see a lineup where every player just fits together. It's so hard to hit that combination.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a question then that this was making me think of, because one of the reasons why I also think like super tactical execute styles, it's not that they don't work, because as we just talked about, like Astralis can do it, in the past the Very Games teams did it, but one of the reasons why they're like a bit more diminished in terms of how effective they are is because one thing we did not have in 1.6 was a pistol that costs $500 that you can just pop out and pop everyone's head off with. And even worse, when it's like a 5.7, you could spam that motherfucker and just put like 6 bullets in someone. So that didn't exist in 1.6, right? You could kind of, unless they're on a full buy, and first of all, forced buys are obviously a lot more risky, right, at that point in time, because, if they don't make it work and if you kill the guns, they're kind of fucked. So how do you see the difference there? Because it must be harder to game plan in that sense as well.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, like, it's when I think what you game planning for, it's maybe just more overall that you just have to accept that sometimes some player just has this magic pistol that does crazy things, and you just have to move on really quickly and not get tilted by it. That's really just how it is. You can try to game plan all you want, but sometimes the deagle specifically just does things that shouldn't be possible.
But I mean, the angle I was thinking of to ask you about in that respect, though, is like, for example, yes, there was a deagle in 1.6, but first of all, like, if you're a CT and you buy a deagle on a save, like, good luck with your economy, it doesn't even make fucking sense often. But I mean, I know Russian teams did it all the time, but there's a reason why Swedish teams played with a USP. You just need to save the money. But one of the things I think it definitely changed, obviously, is most of the OP pistols are incredibly OP if you're at short ranges. So now you have to play completely differently if you know you're against a pistol compared to a weapon now, don't you?
Yeah, you do. So, yeah, we obviously also use specific tactics against pistols. For example, cobblestone, again, is a good example of how you approach it differently when you're playing against pistols. Because you're really afraid of playing... right now it's the CC. That's really OP. So you're trying to molly all these close angles, so you can come out on plateau, for example, and play range against the pistols. And overall, that's what you try to do most of the time, to clear the close angles with mollies and then play long range against their pistols. And then you die to deagle, and then it's just annoying.
Which in itself says how OP these guns are now. Yeah. Teams that have full weaponry and some of the best players in the world have to use utility to not get killed by pistols. Like, if we're just playing versus pistols at 1.6, like, I might use a nade if it's a common spot, but I want that guy to take a duel with me and I have an AK and he has a USP from half the map away. That's an ideal scenario for my best player to win the fight very easily,
Yeah, and also when you played, for example, as terrorist, when you played the anti-Csgo, you would just the guys who killed somebody on the pistol would drop an AK to somebody else, and then you would just run around with a USP as terrorist and with armor, and then you would be fine if SMGs wasn't used back then. Yes. So you could get by just having 3 AKs and 2 USPs as a terrorist and play anti-Csgo that way.
Yeah, that is very different, because obviously you end up with these weird buy scenarios in CSGO where it's like, if we save the SMGs, sometimes we have worse weaponry when they have the guns. If the terrorists buy the full AKs, if they buy early, actually you can have worse there wasn't really as many options as that. And another thing as well is, in 1.6, you pretty much almost always upgrade if you keep winning the rounds. You don't keep a FAMAS when you're going to, it might be an AK, because then you're going to mad disadvantage. People do keep the fucking UMP sometimes now. Like, it just throws everything off in a mad way. I mean, the maddest, Moses, was earlier this year. It was when they won that DreamHack Malmo. Did you ever see the tactic that G2 was using, where Shox would even spend gun rounds with an MP9 because he was trying to farm money to give Kenny S an AWP because it's so expensive, right? That concept doesn't even exist. Like, it was blowing my mind when I was even seeing it. Like, what is this game? Am I watching Call of Duty now? He's running around with an MP9 trying to take close range fights with motherfuckers.
Here's the thing. I don't think it's necessarily, the pistols are overpowered, but I think the most overpowered part about the pistols is that obviously in an effort to make every gun used, they've created like strengths and weaknesses to all the weapons, right? So the big struggle with like the pistols and the SMGs is the fact that they are very much more run and gun. And if like you get up to a close angle where you're turning a corner with the pistol, oftentimes you have an advantage, especially with the CZ. So that's where the real problem comes in, where you make the AK and the M4 are incredibly unwieldy in certain situations.
To contrast it this way, even pistols that you would move with, you have to stop to fire them in 1.6. The Deagle, you have to stop to fire it. The USP, generally you're stopping to fire it because it just gets a lot more less effective if you spam it while moving. The problem is there's a lot of guns in CSGO where it's actually better to spam and move. So you're making it a moving target, so it's even harder to hit, right? Yeah,
you think the Tech 9 pre-nerf, the CZ, the P250, all of those, and even especially the SMGs, all those are to a degree like the run and gun, where you can run with it and spray with it. And even if you don't get the kill, like if your opponent has an AK or an M4, they have to stop to take the shot. And while they're dealing with you and perhaps missing their first 5 bullets because you're jumping all over the place, the second guy's going to come out and just skull fuck them. So the pistols are just...
Is that a technical term, is it, Moses? Okay.
It's going to start. I think I'll use that during my next broadcast, but that's the real scary part of those pistols. And I remember in 1.6... like you never won those rounds. I remember being in a match on, for an ESWC qualifier and having to play in overtime, and we had a round where we were only able to buy deagles, and we basically just sat and spawned. We're like, well, boys, this is it. We won the round, and it was like the biggest miracle there was. But like that was the extent of it. Was just like when you in 1.6, when you're stuck on those rounds, you're just like, this is like such a low percentage chance that we win this. And I like that CSGO has made it more likely to win those rounds. I think there should be a bigger risk in those rounds, or at least a risk of doing damage. But I think it's gone too far, and I don't even necessarily think it's Valve's fault on this one. I think it's probably so hard to make changes to those pistols to have like that perfect, that perfect danger percentage of those second rounds of those ecos, because they've done a lot of changes to all the different weapons, and nothing's really panned out at the moment.
Yeah. I think like what makes it different compared to 1.6 is just how the game is different in terms of how big the models are. And in 1.6, the models just felt like they were so much smaller, so you have to be much more precise.
Yeah. The map was wider, right?
That's also a way to put it. The map was so wide, so it was just different to play pistols back then. Today, it's not that hard to hit a headshot with the pistol as it was back in 1.6. So I feel like that's the main thing that makes pistol so good and really hard for Valve to fix.
Okay. Here's something we didn't really touch on, but you mentioned it earlier, was how different the smokes and flashbangs were. Like this also goes to like the wide choke points thing. But I remember in 1.6, if you ever watched those demos, it took 2 smokes to appropriately block a choke point with smoke. You'd have 2 players use 2 smokes. If you just threw one, you could still be seen easily through the smoke. It just barely obscured the vision, so you had to use 2 to cross, unless you're online and motherfuckers were using smoke sprites, and then they just didn't have any. But
16-bit, mate. I used to use the old 16-bit on my graphics card, and then I would lie and tell everyone I had 32-bit.
You fucking rat.
Wow. Listen, a lot of online people were doing that in Sweden. Don't worry.
But no, that certainly changes. Like smokes like that. Like I don't recall having like a universe in where players like necessarily ran through smokes. I don't know if you remember that at all, but but
I don't remember how it was, but I feel like it was actually easier to run through a smoke and shoot your opponent than it is in Global Offensive. So,
well, yeah, I mean the smokes in Global Offensive are just like essentially 17-second walls, aren't they?
Yeah, it was just, and also it wasn't as big.
The height of it's crazy in CSGO, isn't it? It's so tall.
And also, it uses a lot of space, where in 1.6 it felt like it was smaller, I think.
Well, at 1.62 it did the crazy thing where you throw the smoke and it settles and then it fizzles out. It doesn't like plume. It took like 3 seconds for the smoke to actually cover up a choke point. It was insanity. And the flashbangs as well. That was one of the things I used to love about 1.6. I can't even imagine it today, but remember the flashbangs, you still had your hearing. You got blind.
Yes. But that was good. That was a good factor, yeah.
That was sick because you could actually, it wasn't even like guessing at timing. It was like you hear the footsteps as they turn the corner and you take the shot, which was awesome. But I couldn't imagine that in today's game. If you
Speaking of which, I mean, Ave referenced it earlier, but that's also where my boy Nothing, if you remember his famous movie, all day long in that movie, he's just getting mad flashbang kills, and he was trying to claim that to me, like, no, I could just hear them, and I was like, you were cheating, motherfucker. I saw some of those clips. Those were outrageous, some of those kills. Like, yeah, you can hear someone, doesn't mean you just instantly headshot them all, like 3 in a row, come on. Yeah. What do you think is different then about the flashes and smokes then, Ave? Because how does it factor in, for example, when you play the tactical game in that sense? Yeah,
one thing I felt like that made us much better, a good tactical team, was that we understood how flash worked. I don't think a lot of the teams actually knew this, but when you got full blinded by a flash, so if the opponent would look at your flashbang, you would get full flashed, as we said. And if you had been full flashed within, I think, 10 seconds or something, if a flashbang would pop behind you, then it would reset that counter, so you would get full flash again.
Right?
Yeah. So you could. So the way we structured our executes was to make sure that we throw a pop flash somewhere, and then we would just spam flashes in his back while we ran into the side. So I feel like that made some of our executes really, really good. And today it feels like flashes aren't as valued as it was back then. You kind of want to throw your molly or your smoke before you throw your flash.
Well, you can also add that obviously in 1.6 you can self-flash because you have the second, you have the mouse 2, right? Whereas obviously you didn't have that ability to just chuck it up. So in a way that made the individual plays cooler, but it did change like the tactical element because now you don't need as many people to even flash that area to get on the corner, you know. The whole point is, for people who don't know, in 1.6, I can't throw my own pop flash. Someone else has to throw it for me so that it pops as I come out the corner. So that's why if you ever go and look at that classic video, there's one of MTW I know where it's some of your tactics from back in the day where it's like, you know, you can see every player knows the timing of when the flash goes off so that he then comes around the corner and then the next guy advances, you know. That doesn't really exist in CSGO. No one's running like some super advanced, like 5 people flash into a certain one area of the map. You just throw your flashes off and then you look around the corner, basically.
Yeah, it feels more random right now in Global Offensive, but I feel like it's one of the areas where a lot of teams could improve, is to use the flashes correctly, and especially as a CT side, I feel like there are so many situations where one flash can make a round so much easier, and it's not all the time that you see people prioritize their flashes because they have a molly or whatever. So I feel like it's an area where a lot of teams could improve, and also my own teams.
Certainly. So shout out to them if they're listening. Improve. Fucking listen to him. He's telling you about Flashbangs. Listen, learn.
They know.
Get to work, bitches. Flashbangs. I don't like the pin sound of our current Flashbangs.
So you know when it's coming, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's silly.
Annoying.
I think it should be there for underhand. It would just be way too OP if you just could like silently underhand pop flash into a smoke and jump through. But for the overhand, I don't like it.
Yeah. That's also, by the way, to give context again for people who didn't play 1.6, that's also what made the pop flash so effective. Is that, okay, yes, you can sort of hear like it bounce off the wall, but even if you hear that, if it's done well, the whole point is it only you try to angle it so it only explodes the millisecond it comes on the corner. So the point is you can't just react to it. You have to know it's coming to be able to dodge it, basically. Yeah. And even then, there's another level to that, because even if you know it's coming, then teams would be like, right, well, one pop flash goes off in front and the other goes off behind. So choose which one you would like to be blinded by, because if you turn around, you get blinded by that one as well.
Oh, like by the way,
I'll give you an example, okay? Like I was talking to someone, I won't say who it is, I won't throw them under the bus, but someone from 1.6, right, that had just gotten into CSGO a year or two ago, and they were trying to tell me, like, all these modern teams, they don't understand what they're doing, you know, like, when they play Dust 2, you know, they're just giving up catwalk. You're supposed to hold that, and then you're supposed to flash your way out, and I was like, dude, if you even play it in CSGO, you will get so fucked if you try having 2 people on that catwalk like that, just sitting there, waiting for everything to come in, like, come on.
You get banged the fuck out.
You know, it looks the same, but it's not.
The funny thing as well is 1.6, remember, most pros had really low sensitivity. We didn't have like this high sensitivity that CSGO players have now, so you couldn't even really turn from flashbangs all that well. I remember like there were certain players that had to like swipe their mouse like 4 or 5 times to be able to like turn around and do a 360. So that shit's just like unwieldy.
I feel like a lot of our players kind of played high sensitivity, actually.
Oh, maybe that's
I like Forrest. Forrest was kind of the role model for a lot of players, so he kind of set the meta. Because he was so good for such a long period. So I think a lot of people played his settings. But I agree, I also saw players who played really low sensitivity. So I don't know.
What do you think about the fact that, if you remember, okay, here's a real blast from the past, is that in your best year, 2008, okay, yeah, you had Sunder, who was an AWPer. At the time, you know, obviously Na'Vi hadn't formed properly, like, Fnatic obviously was like DSN AWP'd a bit, but in general that was actually an era where there was a lot of teams that ran like 5 rifles all the time. Like a lot of the time you just have the 5 AKs, you use a tactic, you get onto the site, and AWP's not that big a deal. Like maybe an AWP's more of a CT weapon in some senses, right? But yes, later in 1.6 you had the Delpans of the world and the Markov, so yes, it became more important to have an AWPer because the other team has an AWPer. But even with that said, I don't think I can ever remember any era in CS 1.6 that was like the current era, where basically the only thing that decides if you double AWP on certain maps is if you have enough money. If you have enough money, people double AWP on so many of the maps. You know, that was very, very rare in 1.6, right?
Yeah, it was basically only on Train you did that. I don't recall we did it on any other maps. So yeah, I mean, like, it makes sense that the AVP is good, especially as CT, because if your placement is good, then you should hit your shot, and that's 1 kill. And so it makes sense that we see this meta where people go for at least 2 AVPs if they have money for it, and sometimes even I see people go for 3 AVPs. So yeah, but in 1.6, it was only train where you could, the rotation guy played AWP while the early player or bomb side player would use it as well.
Yeah,
I was about to say Cobblestone, but I remembered at that point in time,
the stupid
that was
map.
removed.
Yeah. It was insane back then. It was so big,
so
like
huge,
insanely big,
and it was just like a wide open area as well at that B-bomb site.
And then you have to remember they did force it back upon us, where it was like forged. That was like
that was
pure
shit,
ass. That was one of the worst maps I've ever seen. They just made us play that in competitive play. Like, why you do this?
Yeah.
Luckily, that was towards the end of Abe's period, so he didn't have to suffer that. It was a few months.
Yeah. Maybe I played it a few times.
I remember watching it at like an ESCA LAN, like one of the late ESCA LANs at 1.6, and I was like, "What the fuck map is this?"
It was bad, fucking bad map, mate.
Yeah.
Okay.
I liked CPL Fire. I always thought that map got a bad rap. I love that map.
It was all right, actually. Yeah, it wasn't that bad.
The problem with it, obviously, is any map that has those fences, because depending on the resolution you use, you just couldn't see through them. Like some people couldn't, some people couldn't. So like when you have that texture, it just fucks the whole system up, doesn't it?
Yeah, I remember that. Also, Tuscan was a pretty good map. It's a shame that it didn't really work out in Global Offensive. It does exist, right?
What happened was the guy was making it, and then the problem is, like, this is actually one of the problems in the modern day of esports, is that, you know, in the old days, who knows who the fuck made the map, and you definitely didn't ask the person who made the map's permission to use it in a tournament, you know, like, I'm pretty sure the guy who made DOS 2, no one ever asked him if we can use it in a tournament, because esports is so small. But the problem is nowadays, with IP rights, etc., whoever made that map, I believe it was a guy called Brute, right, who was, like, in charge of making the remake, you know, he's the only one who can make it. And unfortunately, apparently, like, abandoned it halfway through and it had a load of bugs. So it's not like I can just go, well, I'm going to make Thorin Tuscan, you know. So for whatever reason, I think it's just never going to be completed, sadly, because I think it was like a couple of years ago he's supposed to have finished it.
I mean, it doesn't make sense, though, because you can just say, I based it. You could just take the old, you could take
You should just
CPL
reskin it if you're smart.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
It'd just be like, because that's exactly what he did, the motherfucker.
Yeah, that's true.
But I know Mill had a comeback in CSGO early on, and it didn't work out well. It was a tough map.
You may remember it from the famous video of JW possibly cheating online versus Virtus Pro. No, they weren't actually called Virtus Pro at the time, but he probably was cheating. So shout out to JW. You got away with it. Well done. You didn't get banned, and you never had to. You know, you just knew where they all were. So extra sensory perception. Listen, I've always said this, Moses. I love a good heist movie. You know, in the movies where they like do the bank robbery, you want them to get away with it. You're loving it. You're like, oh fuck, I hope they don't get caught. Sad thing is, in real life, you're just ruining everyone else's game when you do that. So please don't cheat, if possible. Okay, I've got a question for you, Abe. So something that people complain about a lot in CSGO that are like tactical players and leaders is that they say that they think the travel schedule is too much, because remember, like, almost every 1.6 tournament lasted 3 days. You know, there was never like a 6-day event. That's quite crazy. Whereas now, premier events are 4, 5, 6 days long, and then you add in that, you know, it's not as simple as when people are like, if you're a top team, just choose not to go to an event. You don't know which one you're going to qualify for. Like, I can't say I'll go to this, I'll skip this LAN, because then what if I don't qualify for EPL? You know, maybe I have to plan to go to it, and then I find out I qualify for EPL the next week later. Fuck, now I've got 2 weeks of it, 2 events in a row. So the complaint that a lot of the tactical guys say is that they say another reason why it sort of emphasizes individual play and having very skilled players is because you don't have as much downtime to actually come up with new shit and to actually run proper scrims, you know, and not just practice to keep in shape, but actually practice a tactic and figure out what you're going to do with an anti-strat guy. Is that tougher in CSGO, do you think?
Yeah, it is really. I mean, the amount of tournaments that's isn't Go, that's, I don't know, it must be double or triple the amount that we played back then. And also, you touched upon it, the thing where you don't know what you don't know what you're going to qualify for. So yeah, it's I can imagine how it is now. We had a really tough schedule with the academy team actually, and it just felt like we never got down to a point where we were really comfortable with our style, because we just had to like make things up on the go a lot of the time. And I feel like the overall level of play decreases when you see people playing this much, because whatever issues every team has, they don't get the time to really figure out how to solve them. And I think it's a shame. So hopefully somebody makes the proper schedule for tournament organizers. Would be so nice.
I know that's one of Moses' pet peeves.
Yeah.
All that Skrilla, Duncan.
See, that's the problem, Moses. That's why, in a way, you're actually a very selfless person, because the less events there are, the less money you get paid. So you should be going the other way, mate. You should be like, let's have events every day.
No, listen, I'll take less events as well. I'll take less events. I'll just charge more. That's how we fix that.
Reasonable.
No, but I think it's mostly like it's the online leagues. I think that's the big issue, and it's a weird problem because I think you do need at least one online league. But the problem is, you go to a tournament, you travel, the events these days are 4 or 5 days. You come home and your team is playing in matches the next day. If you're broadcast talent, of course, you get back from IEM Sydney and you have a broadcast the day you land. So fair play for the players. Got that extra day break. Congratulations. But either way, yeah, there's no time to actually practice and come up with something new, and you just get so burnt out. And the last thing you want to do when you have a schedule, when you have 5 out of 6 weeks traveling for events, the last thing you're going to do is be like, all right, yeah, I'll join the server. Let's do like an hour and a half of dry running tactics. Let's talk theory. And the only thing you want to do at that point is just you want to frag. You just want to go headshot people. So it's tough in that sense. I think the other thing kind of holding it back as well, and I'm astonished that this hasn't happened yet, is I think it's gotten to the point where it's so insane. Like we did it in 1.6 just out of like necessity, but it is so insane to me that your professional team practices against other professional teams with the new tactics that they want to develop. And if you change something, you're practicing against a squad. You're practicing against the Virtus Pro. You're practicing against, Fnatic. It doesn't make any fucking sense because in that sense, everything that you want to try, you either have to try it out for like the first or second time in a match setting, in a tournament setting, or 2, you try it out in practice and everyone's going to know it's coming. Because it's insane to think that there's friends on Fnatic and FaZe, right? And it's insane to think that they don't have a chat and be like, oh yeah, we played North today, and this motherfucker, this is what they started to do.
Yeah.
So I think we got to get to the point where there's, almost like the NBA or almost like the NFL, where you have, maybe a team is maybe next year North is 10 players, and you can freely sub any of those players into your main lineup, whatever. That would help with travel. That would help players get breaks. That would help with all that. But also you have a second team, essentially a practice team that you just get to scrim against, and that you get to just try new things, and you don't have to worry about winning or losing, because there is always a pride element when you scrim an opposing professional team and you say, I really want to fucking win.
Yeah.
You take that factor out of it. So I think in that sense, that would help teams tactically moving forward into the future as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. I actually remember it also was an issue in 1.6. I remember Lurpus' team, they kind of blacklisted us in MTW because he got so scared of me traveling with my laptop. So before we would play them, we would sit around my laptop and we would talk about how they played. Most of that was just by demo reviews, but I might have wrote a little note or two when we practiced them. But I agree with you. It's an annoying thing to worry about when you play a professional team, that you have to worry about. Will they remember we did this execute on them when we play them 1 month after?
Well, because it's always like I remember I talked to Starix when he was still coaching Navi, and I mean it would obviously work with a team like Astralis with Cobblestone, Navi with Cash, and just being like, have you guys ever thought like going into a major just for 2 weeks or like a week leading up to the major, you just bust your ass on Cash and you just figure out how to play it, and you come up with tactics and no one's ever seen you on it, and then when you're in like a must-win game and you're an underdog or something like that, you just bust out this Cash pick. It'd be a gamble, but like no one would know what the fuck to expect on it, so you have a little bit of an advantage that way, especially if you're prepared. And their answer is always, there's no point in us doing that because the people that we would practice against and try to improve on are the teams we play in the event, so there's no point. And I'm like, well, that's...
People would, Also, North had Train as their main permaban back in the summer, and then they changed it to Cash. But it wasn't. They won on it against SK, I believe, actually, in their first match. So, but I don't think SK was surprised. I bet people already knew that North started practice and Train. So, it would be cool if everyone could figure out another way to practice. I I'm a software engineer, so I've thought about like maybe you could program some bots or something to run the same.
Okay, AI,
yeah. So you could point to a round in a demo and say, okay, bots, make this just follow the same footsteps as the opponent did in this round. And
it would basically be like the War Room from the X-Men cartoon series from the early 90s, where they used to be able to program it so it made like robots and kind of straight fire reference for any kid who's from the 90s.
It's absolutely straight fire.
Wasn't bad, was it? Yeah.
No, it wasn't bad at all.
It would be cool if you could do stuff like that, because that would take that element of worry out of.
Because
listen, here's the thing: don't ever mention that idea ever again. That's like $1 million idea right there.
It's a pretty good idea, yeah.
The way Valve arranged it, I think Valve have to do something in order to.
Yes.
You can make bots.
We'll talk to them. We'll talk to them at the major. Okay. You just let me know what I need to ask them.
Okay. Yeah. But actually, that's one of the reasons when we talk about like the massive schedule, and especially obviously you add in online play and it becomes like you're playing almost every day. That's another reason why when I get very critical of online play, because I don't think the results really tend to match up that much when you see offline, like there's way too many teams can win online. Like the best example to me was this season of EPL, where LDLC, which has got to be one of the like lowest skill-powered teams I've ever seen. It was basically just existence and a bunch of people who can't get into G2 and Envious. They were literally like mid-table for the entire time, winning games against teams that were way better than them just because it was online. But another factor I think plays into that is that because of the travel, I know for a fact there are teams who actually use their official online games in ECS and EPL as the practice. They use that to run the new tactic and to test it, because their logic is like, this is just week 4 of EPL, so let's use this to test something out, because, the LAN that's coming up next week, we don't have 4 days of solid, dry running and practicing. We've got to practice somewhere.
Yeah, it makes sense. Also, like, I can't remember how many of the teams qualify for the LAN finals, but I guess the goal for the top 5 team is just to get to the LAN finals. Anyways, it doesn't really matter that much if you're seed 3 or 6 or whatever. It just as long as you hit the LAN finals, you're fine.
Well, now it doesn't matter as well with the way they picked the seeds, which was pretty cool last time as well.
That was awesome, wasn't it? That little change. I thought it was sick.
That's pretty
cool. Almost if you think about it, for anyone who doesn't know, what they did is instead of before they used to just seed based on where you placed in EPL. So if you placed first, you got like the best seed for a group. What they did this time as a little tweak is they made it so that each person in the group, but starting with the top seeds, what you did instead was you picked who was in the other group. So if you think about what's actually genius about that is it incentivizes every team to make the other group as hard as possible. But because we're taking turns, we're going to both end up with about an even as group as we can end up with. So it was actually very clever, because you're never going to get a group that's going to be all the best teams in one, because after I pick one that's really hard for you, you pick one that's really hard for me. It's actually quite a clever little change, I thought. So anyway, we're coming towards the end now, because this is how far life's come. He actually has like family and stuff. He's got other requirements. He can't just sit online talking about CS all day anymore. So is there sort of a final topic or anything you want to touch on before we close up? Is there anything left, any burning desire before the end of this conversation?
I don't have anything, I believe. Okay. I feel like we've been around all the things.
Okay, I've got a question for you then. Yeah. Is there still like the drive? Like, is the goal for Ave to one day be like the best coach in the world and be the coach of like the number 1 team, and to literally, bring back the days you were referencing before, where when you pull out the notebook at the LANs, you see the shudder in the other teams. Oh shit, it's the notebook. Is that the goal?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing it full time, so of course it's my goal to progress and become a better coach. But I still have a ways to go. I feel like I'm pretty good at the analyzing and the strategical part, but I feel like maybe I need to become a better motivator for people.
Is it hard to coach? Because obviously we didn't have coaches in 1.6.
Yeah, it's hard. It's also because you're so emotionally invested all the time, and still you feel kind of powerless when you are stripped down to only talking in freeze time, and also people have to figure out drops in freeze time, and it's not a lot of time to talk really. And it was different to be an in-game leader, because you can talk. You could just use when you're saving weapons, you could sit and talk, and it's much different. And it's hard, but
actually, you make a good point there. Like, yeah, it's true. The problem is because you can only talk in freeze time in some of these tournaments. Like,
yeah, and timeouts, of course.
They should maybe make the freeze time longer then, because actually that's true. You are also using up the time. Like, can I have up, please? Like, shut the fuck up and try and talk here. Like,
usually it takes like at least around 5 seconds just to figure out drops sometimes, and then you have 10 seconds left, and you have to like think about what are you gonna call, and and then you get auto muted. So oftentimes what happens is that when I figure out what's with the perfect call, then I'm already muted. So it's too late.
Yes, at the end of the call. It's like
coach struggle.
It's a bit like on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, where you have that call a friend, and then that at the end they're always like, I think it's like, what did he say? The time worn out. What the fuck?
Yeah.
Please, I need this.
Config, you're gonna, and on this strategy config you're gonna do, and then auto mute kicks in, and what do I do? What do I do? Fuck. Yeah. Are you one of those guys who thinks that the coaches should be able to talk like more, or like, you have those coaches who come out and they say, I think the Valve coaching rules are fine. Like, you just get to talk during the 15-second freeze time, but everyone else on the scene is just like, fuck that guy.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the rationale Valve has, that it shouldn't be too much of an advantage to have a coach. So the teams that don't have a coach aren't struggling more. So I get the point, but still, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of fair, but it's still a struggle for me to get used to it. But I think it's on me, mostly.
I'm Device from Australia, and welcome to Thorin's YouTube channel. It's a joke-free zone.